An eviction court judge says that a Washington, D.C. landlord has to wait even longer, even though his tenant hasn't paid him rent in more than 3 years. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's one of those stories about an awful tenant who took advantage of a situation in order to not pay rent for as long as possible. And you know what that situation was. It was the whole COVID-19 pandemic eviction moratorium nonsense. So this landlord up in Washington, D.C., one of the worst places to be a landlord, mind you, but this landlord got taken advantage of by a tenant who just played the system and has lived for free for years on end. Meanwhile, they still have all their bills that they have to pay, including taxes, insurance, mortgage, etc. So you can see why this would be financially one of the worst things possible to happen to you. I don't really give a darn about this tenant or what their supposed situation is, right? And the truth of the matter is that we operate businesses just like the grocery store, right? We have to be paid for the services or the goods that we provide. Otherwise, we can't stay in business. But maybe their plan is to drive us out of business, whatever. I don't really give a darn, but this is why I don't have sympathy for these scammer tenants, okay? If you're going through a hard time, that isn't our fault. That is your fault. If you lose your job, that is your fault. If you're facing an illness, that is your responsibility, okay? Paying your bills is your responsibility. It isn't. I'm not your social welfare provider. I'm not the government. I am not a nonprofit. I operate a for-profit business, and I deserve to be paid the money that I am owed, the money that you agreed to when you signed that contract. Okay, so this is another story of a tenant who takes advantage of this sort of situation. I have no sympathy for them. I want them to be kicked to the curb. I don't give a darn if Washington, D.C. is one of the most expensive places in the entire country to live. You're a scammer. And you took advantage of a landlord who had provided you housing. So, you know what? Maybe you need to go live on the street corner for a little bit. So, before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. So, would it make you upset if this person ended up homeless after scamming this landlord for 3+ years? Wouldn't bother me one bit, okay? Go live in your car. Go live under a bridge or something. You're nothing but a thief. Maybe that's what you deserve. But anyway, let's get into this article and see what it says. This article is coming from NBCWashington.com, and it says DC landlord forced to wait longer after he says tenants haven't paid rent in 3 years. Yeah, it's a bad situation overall, right? And you got to wonder what this eviction court judge is thinking. Okay, these tenants, they start all this, oh well, we're not paying rent because this is broken or that, whatever. Okay, it's been 3 years. There's no way all that stuff was broken for those 3 years. But anyway, let's get into the article, see what it says. A DC landlord who tells the News 4i team he hasn't been paid rent in 3 years will have to wait at least another 4 months to get a trial on evicting the tenants. John Jones owns a single 2-bedroom unit in Southeast DC. The I-team first met Jones when he complained he was missing $14,000 from a COVID-era rent relief program. City documents show the check was sent in 2021 to the tenants and cashed, but they never sent the money to the landlord. Jones says they haven't paid rent for a few months before or since. He claims he is now owed $46,800. Now, I might have covered this story before, but if I didn't, okay, let me clarify this right now. There were some cities, some municipalities in these more left-leaning places where they had the bright idea of, rather than sending the landlord the rent relief money, they sent a check to the tenant. And guess what the tenant did? It shouldn't be a surprise. In a lot of cases, tenants did not turn that money over to their landlords, the money that they owed the landlords. Instead, they pocketed it, right? Continued to live free in the units because the eviction moratoriums were still in place. So basically, you paid the tenant to live for free in someone else's property. These cities are so dumb, okay? And instead of going after these tenants, charging them with fraud, charging them with misuse of government funds, etc. Right? These are felony crimes. They just say, oh well, we don't know what happened. Well, you know what? This is my problem. Okay, this is my problem with these ridiculous socialist programs. They're just filled with fraud, waste, and abuse, and that's exactly what you saw with these rental assistance programs. And these people, they took advantage of it. They took advantage of the landlord. They basically stole money from the government that was meant to pay for the rent, and there's no consequences for them whatsoever. And we will end up in a country full of people who do just this sort of thing if we keep pushing this socialist agenda. And that's why I'm so against it. I'm so against all of this nonsense, this government overreach, this socialist agenda, this anti property rights nonsense. Okay? We need to go back to being what we should have been in the first place, a capitalist country where we have strong property rights. Property rights are the basis of all rights. And we need to make sure that we maintain them and keep them strong. Otherwise, what are we going to be living in? We're going to be living in a communist country. That's what we're going to be living in. But anyway, let me continue with this story. Jones waited for DC's eviction moratorium to expire and months later filed an eviction petition. His first case was dismissed, he says, because the judge told him he needed to hire a lawyer. His second petition was filed this spring, and 6 months later, he got his first hearing Wednesday. In court, one of the tenants, DeMonte Cosbert, told the magistrate judge he hadn't paid rent due to a lack of conditions. That's one possible reason the rent wasn't paid. Cosbert, who attended the hearing remotely, said the stove outlets and smoke detectors weren't working. The other tenant, Shondell Wren, initially called into the hearing but dropped off after Cosbert said her phone died. So let me go over this quick timeline for you. The guy hasn't been paid rent in over 3 years, right? It says that his first case was dismissed because the eviction court judge said he needed to have a lawyer. He couldn't go in there and represent himself and then, explain the story and say, hey, these tenants have scammed me out of tens of thousands of dollars, because the judge just wouldn't hear it. And then he had to wait months on end. Months on end. It says his second petition was 6 months later. He had to wait 6 additional months to get his first hearing. That is ridiculous, because the judge wouldn't even listen to his case. You can't tell me that the tenant doesn't have an advantage in a place like Washington, D.C. when you read this sort of timeline. Okay? And then he goes in there, and what do the tenants start doing? They start lying immediately. They start, oh, well, the reason we haven't paid rent for 3+ years is because appliances and outlets and smoke detectors aren't working. Well, excuse me, but if your house is unlivable, how the heck were you staying in there for 3 years? And besides, this is minor stuff. All the judge would have had to say is, listen, smoke detectors, a few power outlets, and a couple of appliances does not make up for the fact that you didn't pay $47,000 in rent. That is ridiculous, okay? You are kicked to the curb, and we'll subtract the cost of a little bit of this for these minor problems. I mean, heck, I have smoke detectors in some of my units where the batteries have gone dead. That doesn't mean that my tenant doesn't need to pay me the rent. What a joke. Oh man, this judge screwed this landlord over even more. Magistrate Judge Stephen Rickard told the tenant he may be able to reduce a portion of the rent due to the appliance issue, and set it for a hearing in mid-December, 3 months from now. During the hearing, Jones was not asked about the appliances at all, but minutes later outside the courthouse, he told the I-Team he's never been told those appliances weren't working until now, and called it a way to avoid paying. And he's absolutely right. The tenant never told him, probably because it's not a true issue. It's not a true issue. Maybe the appliances were working, maybe they weren't working, right? But the tenant is just using the issue to drag out the process, make it last 3 more months where this tenant doesn't have to pay rent. If the rent is $1,000 or $2,000 a month, let's just say it's $2,000 a month, right? Well, that's an additional $6,000 that this tenant doesn't have to pay. What a joke. What a joke. And they wonder why people don't want to be landlords. They don't want to be landlords because the government isn't on your side. They won't even help you when you're in the right. When you're in the right and everything should be relatively easy to explain, they tell you, no, no, you're too dumb to be able to represent yourself. Go hire a lawyer. Then you wait an additional 6 months. You've paid a lawyer thousands of dollars just so that the lawyer can say what you would have told the judge immediately for yourself. Okay? And then even after you hire the lawyer, the tenant comes in there, tells a blatant lie. The judge could have made an easy decision that very day. And rather than do that, they say, no, no, we're going to give them an additional 3 months. No, this is horrible. This is horrible. And, I feel for this landlord, but, this is a learning lesson for you. In particular, those people who invest in places like Washington, D.C., like New York, like California. Okay? This is how you get treated. It's never a problem until it becomes a problem. When you're getting paid your rent, when you put a tenant first in your property, right? You're a small landlord. You're like, hey, I'm going to rent out my property, and you put a tenant in there and everything is, flowing smoothly. You're getting paid that money, you're making that money, you're doing well. It's not a problem. But then when your tenant maybe doesn't pay or doesn't pay on time, or maybe you get a bad tenant up in there and you try to remove that tenant, suddenly you've got a big, big problem. Okay. And that's why I suggest, consider investing somewhere else with more property rights where they treat landlords with respect.